The gate was old, weathered to a pale silver gray by 3 years of Dust Creek sun and wind, and it creaked under Elsie Keene's white-knuckled grip as she stared at the man standing on the other side of it like he had grown there from the very earth itself. Bernard Weston did not flinch. He did not reach for his hat, did not shuffle his boots in the dirt the way lesser men did when a woman looked at them with the particular brand of fury Elsie was currently wearing. He simply stood there, all 6 feet and 2 inches of him, broad-shouldered in his black leather vest with the silver star catching the last amber light of the October sunset, and he looked at her with those dark gray eyes that seemed to hold entire storms behind them. "I said get off my property," Elsie said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. Everything else about her felt like it was shaking, her hands, her heart, the fragile scaffolding she had spent 3 years building around herself like a fortress. "I heard you," Bernard said. "Then you are standing on the wrong side of that gate, Sheriff." "I am standing exactly where I mean to stand, Miss Keene." The word betrayal sat on the tip of her tongue. Betrayal, because that was what this was, wasn't it? He had gone digging where she had begged him not to dig. He had found the secrets she had buried deep under the rocky soil of her past, and now he was standing here at her gate in the dying light looking at her like he knew exactly who she was underneath all of it, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. "You had no right," she said, and now her voice did shake just slightly, just at the edges. "You had no right to go to Abilene and ask those questions." "You are right," he said, and his voice was low and rough and absolutely sincere. "I had no right. I did it anyway." She pressed her lips together so hard they went white. "Then you know everything." "I know enough." The silence that stretched between them was a living thing. Somewhere behind her in the little house, her 3-year-old son Thomas was sleeping, and the sound of his small, quiet breathing was the only thing that had kept Elsie Keene upright through every hard day since she had ridden into Dust Creek on a wagon with nothing but a single trunk and a burned-out heart. Bernard Weston reached up and took hold of the top rail of the gate, not pushing it, not trying to open it, just resting his large, rough hand on the wood the way a man rests a hand on a promise. "I will still be here," he said quietly, "when you are ready to let someone in." And then he turned and walked away down the dirt road toward town, and Elsie Keene stood at her gate until the dark swallowed him whole, and she pressed one hand to her mouth and let herself feel every terrible, beautiful, devastating thing she had been refusing to feel for 3 very long years. Dust Creek, Kansas, October 1878. To understand how Elsie Keene came to stand at that gate with a breaking heart, you have to understand what she was before she arrived in Dust Creek, and what she arrived carrying. Elsie had been born Eleanor Margaret Keene in the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, in the year 1851, the youngest daughter of a printer and his wife. She had grown up with ink on her fingers and books in her hands, and she had believed, with the absolute iron conviction of a girl who had read too many novels, that love was the grandest and most reliable thing in the world. She was 22 years old when she met Robert Hale at a church social, and she was 23 when she married him, and she spent the next 3 years learning how catastrophically wrong she had been about both love and reliability. Robert Hale was handsome and charming in the way that certain men are, the way that functions like a trap. He was also a gambler, a drinker, and a liar of considerable skill, and by the time Elsie had cataloged all of his sins, she was 26 years old, 7 months pregnant, and living in a rented room in Kansas City with a husband who had gambled away every cent they owned. He was killed in a card game in the autumn of 1877, shot through the chest by a man who had accused him of cheating, which he had been, though that was cold comfort to Elsie, who sat in the county hospital and held his hand while he died and felt, beneath the appropriate grief, something that frightened her: relief. The guilt of that relief had shaped everything that came after. It had made her suspicious of joy. It had made her terrified of her own heart. She had given birth to Thomas James Hale 6 weeks later, alone except for a midwife named Mrs. Bauer who charged her $3 she could barely spare. And then, with a newborn son and $37 and a trunk that she could barely lift. She had done the only thing she could think to do. She had looked at an advertisement in the Kansas City newspaper. A small settlement in southwestern Kansas called Dust Creek was advertising for settlers. Land was available, good soil, water rights, a growing community. She had packed Thomas into the wagon of a settler family named Pryor who were heading that way, and she had come. Dust Creek was not what the advertisement had suggested. It was a town of perhaps 200 people arranged along a single main street, with a church at one end, a saloon at the other, a general store, a land office, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a doctor's surgery, a school that operated 3 days a week, and a sheriff's office that looked like it had been built by someone who had only heard a building described to them once. The sheriff at the time of Elsie's arrival had been a soft man named Calhoun who had a fondness for whiskey that bordered on devotion, and he had barely noticed her. Bernard Weston had arrived in Dust Creek 8 months after Elsie, in the summer of 1878, and he had arrived with a commission from the county seat at Dodge City and a reputation that preceded him like a weather front. Elsie had heard about him before she saw him. Martha Pryor, who had become her closest friend in Dust Creek, had told her that the new sheriff was a man called Weston who had previously served in Ellsworth and before that had ridden with a ranging company in Texas, and that he was known for being straight and fair and absolutely unyielding. "Is he handsome?" Elsie had asked, and then immediately wished she hadn't, because Martha's smile went wide and knowing in a way that was deeply inconvenient. "Depends on what you find handsome," Martha said. "He is not a pretty man, but he is a considerable one." Elsie had filed that information away and returned her attention to her garden, which she was coaxing out of the dry Kansas earth with a stubbornness that matched the earth's own. She had 3 acres on the eastern edge of town, a small house that she had spent the better part of her first month patching and sealing against the Kansas winds, a vegetable garden that was beginning, slowly and grudgingly, to produce 2 chickens named Agnes and Dora, a milk cow named Patience, because that was what the animal demanded of her constantly, and Thomas, who was 14 months old when Bernard Weston rode into Dust Creek and who had recently discovered that the word no was something he could say himself, which he did approximately 40 times a day. Elsie had her hands full. She did not need a considerable man. She needed her garden to produce enough squash to last the winter, and she needed the roof to stop leaking over Thomas's corner, and she needed the nightmares about Robert to visit her less frequently. She did not need, and had not asked for, the way her heart did something ungoverned and startling when Bernard Weston walked into the general store on a Thursday afternoon in early August while she was buying lamp oil, and their eyes met across the counter. He was exactly as Martha had described, not pretty but considerable, a broad, weathered face, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone as the Kansas bluffs, dark gray eyes that were assessing without being unkind, and a mouth that seemed set by habit into something between solemnity and something else she couldn't name. He was perhaps 34 or 35, she estimated. He had dark hair going slightly silver at the temples. He wore his badge with the quiet authority of a man who had earned it through something harder than luck. He had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and then they had both looked away, and Elsie had paid for her lamp oil and left the store and walked home with unusual speed and told herself that she was simply in a hurry because Thomas would be waking from his nap. She was not in a hurry. She was in retreat. And it was the first time in a long time that she had needed to retreat from anything that wasn't grief or fear or hardship. This was something different. This was something that felt like the first green shoot after a long winter, fragile and alarming and unwanted, and yet insistently, stubbornly alive. She buried it. She was good at burying things. For the next several weeks, she managed to avoid Bernard Weston with a discipline that should have made her proud but mostly made her tired. Dust Creek was not a large town. Avoidance required genuine effort. She crossed the street when she saw him coming. She chose her hours at the general store and the post office with strategic care. She declined Martha Pryor's dinner invitation when Martha mentioned casually that she had also invited the new sheriff. "Elsie Keene," Martha had said on that occasion, hands on her wide hips and an expression of maternal exasperation on her face, "you are the most stubborn creature I have ever had the pleasure of knowing, and I say that as a woman who once owned a mule." "I am busy," Elsie said. "You are hiding." "I am busy hiding then. Either way, I cannot come to dinner." But the town had a way of engineering what deliberate effort could not prevent. It was a small place, and Bernard Weston was the sheriff of it. And one September morning Elsie looked out her front window and saw him coming up her road in the early light, moving with that particular unhurried purpose that she was already beginning, against her will, to recognize as his. She had two options: pretend not to be home, which would require convincing Thomas to be quiet, a task roughly equivalent to convincing the wind to stop blowing, or open the door and deal with whatever had brought him here. She opened the door before he reached it, because she refused to be the kind of woman who hid behind her own front door. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps. He took off his hat, which she had not expected, and held it at his side. "Miss Keene," he said, "Sheriff Weston. I apologize for the early hour. It is 7 o'clock. I have been up since 5. He nodded, as though this confirmed something he had suspected about her. "I have a matter I wanted to discuss with you. It concerns your neighbor to the south, Mr. Garrett." Dwight Garrett was a man Elsie had been actively trying to like since her arrival and had so far failed. He was loud, he let his livestock wander through her fence line, and he had a habit of looking at her in the way that certain men looked at widows, not with sympathy, but with a kind of calculating assessment that made her skin crawl. "What about him?" she said. "He has filed a dispute with the land office claiming that 3/4 of an acre of what you purchased is actually part of his claim. I wanted you to know before you heard it from someone else, and I wanted to ask if you have your deed papers." She did have her deed papers. She kept them in a tin box under her bed, alongside Thomas's birth record and $31, which was all that remained of her savings after a summer of necessary repairs and purchasing. She retrieved them that morning while Bernard waited on her porch, and he looked them over with careful attention while Thomas, who had toddled out of the house the moment Elsie's back was turned, stood next to the sheriff's boot and examined the silver star on his vest with the intense concentration of a small person encountering something extraordinary. "That is a star," Bernard said to Thomas, looking down. Thomas said "star" very solemnly and then said "no" and sat down in the dust next to the boot. Something shifted in Bernard Weston's face. It was subtle and gone quickly, but Elsie caught it, a brief, unguarded warmth that crossed his weathered features and then retreated behind the habitual solemnity, like a lamp briefly visible through a closing door. "Your deed is clear," he told her. "The dispute has no foundation. I will take this to the land office this morning and it will be settled by the end of the week." "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it. "Sheriff, how long has Garrett been filing these nuisance claims against people? Because I do not believe I am the first." He looked at her steadily. "You are the fourth. 2 of the previous 3 settled with him to avoid the trouble. The third was the Mueller family, and they had a husband and 4 brothers-in-law, and Garrett thought better of pushing it. So he is targeting the vulnerable." "Yes." "That is vile." "Yes," he said again, and there was something in his voice on that second yes, a particular flatness that told her he found it every bit as vile as she did, and had been waiting for an opportunity to do something about it. The land dispute was resolved in 4 days. Bernard Weston was as good as his word, efficient and thorough, and Dwight Garrett did not bother Elsie again for the remainder of the year. She heard later that Bernard had paid him a private visit that had resulted in Garrett's deciding that his neighbor's boundary lines were, in fact, exactly as their deeds stated. She did not ask what Bernard had said during that visit. She was reasonably certain she did not need to. They began to speak. Not often. Not in any way that could be called courting by even the most generous definition. but Dust Creek had a habit of throwing them together at church, which they both attended with the slightly resigned regularity of people who believed in the principle if not always the practice, at the post office, at Martha Pryor's store, where Martha sold remedies and dry goods and information about everyone in town with cheerful indiscrimination. Bernard Weston did not talk much. That was something Elsie noticed early. He was not quiet in the way of shy men, who avoid speaking because they are afraid. He was quiet in the way of men who have learned that words are substantial things and should not be scattered carelessly. When he did speak, he was direct in a way that she found, after years of Robert Hale's elaborate and practiced evasions, deeply restful. He said what he meant. He meant what he said. It was almost disorienting. One October afternoon, a week before the events at the gate, she had been at the post office when she received a letter from her sister Helen in Cincinnati, and the letter contained information about a man named Croft, a friend of Robert's, or perhaps friend was too generous a word, who had apparently been in Dust Creek asking questions about her. Elsie had read the letter standing at the post office counter, and she had felt the specific cold that comes not from temperature but from old fear waking up. Because the secret she carried was this: Robert Hale had not died clean. His debts had not died with him. The man who had killed him in that card game, whose name was Victor Croft, had subsequently claimed that Robert owed him far more than was on the table that night, claimed it with the kind of specificity that suggested manufacture, and had gone to a judge in Kansas City with papers asserting that Robert's estate, such as it was forfeit to settle this debt. There was no estate. There was nothing. There was Elsie and a newborn son and $37 in a trunk, but Victor Croft had not been satisfied with nothing. He had suggested, through intermediaries and once through a direct and menacing letter, that Elsie herself could settle the debt in ways that did not involve money. When she had fled to Dust Creek, she had been partly fleeing him. She had never told anyone in Dust Creek any of this. She had introduced herself as a widow, which was true, and left the rest of it buried. When she saw Croft's name in her sister Helen's letter, when Helen wrote that a man answering Croft's description had been in Cincinnati asking after Elsie's whereabouts, she felt that cold run through her from crown to heel. She folded the letter with steady hands and walked out of the post office and directly into Bernard Weston, who was coming through the door as she was going out. She did not cry. She had stopped allowing herself to cry in public 18 months ago, when she had realized that tears in a small town were interpreted as weakness by some people and as invitation by others. But something in her face must have shown, because Bernard caught her by the arm with one hand, not hard, just a steadying contact, and said her name. "Miss Keene, what has happened?" "Nothing," she said. "I am fine, excuse me." "You are not fine." It was not said unkindly. It was said the way he said most things, directly, without performance. She looked up at him and found those gray eyes on her face with an attention that was somehow both impersonal and entirely focused. And for one terrible, unguarded moment she wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to hand the whole weight of it to someone else and just breathe without carrying it. She did not. She could not. If she told him, he would do something official about it, and official meant public, and public meant Thomas growing up in a town that knew his father had been a cheating gambler shot over a crooked card game, that his mother had been essentially chased out of her home by a threatening man. Thomas was too. He deserved better than that for his history. "Thank you for your concern," she said, pulling her arm free gently. "I am fine." And she walked home, and she sat at her kitchen table, and she thought for a long time about Victor Croft. And then she did something that, in retrospect, was perhaps not her most carefully considered decision. She wrote a letter to her friend from Kansas City, a woman named Grace Alderton, asking her to make some quiet inquiries about whether Croft had left the city and where he might currently be. She was careful, she thought. She was strategic. She did not mention Dust Creek by name. What she did not know, could not know, was that Bernard Weston had noticed the letter she had been holding when she came out of the post office. Not reading it, not prying, simply observing, as he observed everything, the way a man trained by years of frontier law enforcement observes things as a matter of habit. He had noticed the postmark, Cincinnati. He had noticed the way her face had changed. He had spent the better part of a week thinking about it, telling himself it was none of his business, that she was a private woman who was entitled to her private troubles, that he had no claim on her, and she had made no invitation for his concern. He had then spent one day in Abilene, which was the nearest town of any size, asking quiet questions of his own among the law enforcement and legal community there. He knew people. He had worked the frontier for long enough that he knew people everywhere. What he learned had brought him, on that October evening, to the gate of Elsie Keene's property. He had not expected her to already be standing at it. He had not expected the look on her face, the combination of fury and something else, something raw and terrified, that told him she knew he had gone to Abilene, possibly through the same network of people she had used to send her own inquiries. He had not expected, if he was honest, how the sight of her standing there in the fading light, fierce and frightened and magnificent, would affect him. He had spent the better part of his adult life keeping himself at a careful distance from anything that might affect him this way. He had reasons for that. He had a dark past of his own, carefully managed and seldom discussed, and it had taught him that allowing yourself to want things was the first step toward having them taken from you. But standing at her gate with her eyes blazing at him and her hands tight on the weathered wood, he had said what he said, and he had meant it with a depth that surprised even himself. He walked back to town in the dark and sat in his office and drank one cup of coffee and thought about what he had just done. He had just made a promise, a serious one. He was not a man who made promises lightly, which meant he was going to have to keep it regardless of what it cost him. Dust Creek went quiet at night. The saloon made its noises for a few hours, and then that too fell silent, and the prairie silence came in around everything like water filling a vessel, vast and deep and full of stars. Bernard sat in his office and watched the lamp flame and thought about Elsie Keene. He thought about the first time he had seen her in the general store, the way she had looked at him with eyes that were measuring and wary and intelligent, the way she had looked away with what he recognized as deliberate discipline rather than shyness. He thought about the morning he had come to her house about the Garrett dispute, and Thomas sitting next to his boot saying "Star," with that absolute seriousness of very small children. He thought about the afternoon in September when he had seen her arguing with her cow Patience through her fence, and the cow had been winning the argument, and Elsie had been so thoroughly engaged in making her case to the animal that she hadn't noticed him passing until he said "Good afternoon," and she had turned and looked at him with such startled, vivid embarrassment that he had, for the first time in what felt like years, nearly laughed. He had not allowed himself to think about her this directly or this honestly before. He had managed the whole business with the discipline that had served him through 15 years of dangerous work in difficult places, frontier towns, ranging companies, situations where losing your head got people killed, including you. He had made something of a habit of not wanting what he couldn't have or couldn't hold, and Elsie Keene had seemed very clearly to not want to be wanted by anyone. But he had made the promise now, and he was going to keep it. He also had to deal with Victor Croft, because the information he had gathered in Abilene told a story that required dealing with. Victor Croft was not merely an aggrieved card game opponent. He was a confidence man, an extortionist with a history going back to St. Louis, a man who had built a specific career out of targeting the desperate relatives of men with gambling debts, many of them women, many of them newly widowed, many of them alone and frightened, and with no one to advocate for them. He had a warrant outstanding in Missouri for extortion, and the man in Abilene whom Bernard had spoken with, a U.S. Marshal named Hayes, was very interested indeed in Victor Croft's current whereabouts. The problem was that Croft was, apparently, moving toward Dust Creek. Helen Keene's letter had been intercepted somewhere along the postal route, which was how Croft had obtained intelligence about Elsie's location. The letter to Grace Alderton was likely compromised as well. Bernard had sent a telegram to Marshal Hayes from Abilene. He had come home expecting to speak to Elsie about it in a sensible, measured way, and instead had found himself standing at her gate in the sunset making declarations he hadn't entirely planned to make. He was not sorry for it. He was perhaps slightly embarrassed, but not sorry. The following morning he came to her house again, earlier this time just after 7. He stood at the gate and did not go through it and knocked on the post. Elsie appeared at her front door in a blue work dress with her hair not yet pinned, and she looked at him with an expression that was working very hard at being neutral. "I have information you need to hear," he said. "Not personal information, legal information about Victor Croft." The way she went still told him everything about how much that name frightened her, and the way she then made herself stop being still and came down the porch steps and opened the gate told him everything about how much courage she had. She stepped back to let him through. He came into the yard and she led him to the porch, and they sat in the 2 chairs she had, their plain wooden things she'd made herself, he noticed, with the slightly uneven charm of someone who had learned by doing, and she listened to everything he told her. He told her about Marshal Hayes. He told her about the warrant in Missouri. He told her about the intercepted letters, which he had confirmed through a contact in the Postal Service. He told her clearly and without softening it that Croft was likely within 2 days' ride of Dust Creek. When he finished, Elsie was quiet for a long time. Thomas was playing inside, audible through the screen door, conducting a private negotiation with what sounded like a wooden spoon. "You went to Abilene because of me," she said. "It was not a question." "I went to Abilene because there appeared to be a threat in my jurisdiction that needed assessing," he said, which was true but not the whole truth, and the slight shift of her eyes told him she knew it. "I did not ask for your help," she said. "I know. I was managing it." He considered his response carefully. He had learned, over a long life of dealing with people in difficult situations, that the wrong response to someone's pride was to argue with it. "You were," he said. "You would likely have continued to manage it, but you should not have to manage it alone when there is help available." She looked at him for a long moment. The October morning was cold and bright, and the light made her face very clear, the weariness in it, and the wariness, and underneath those things something else, something she was clearly working very hard to keep beneath the surface. "Why?" she asked. Not what she appeared to be asking, or not only that. He understood the real question. He gave her the honest answer. "Because I would like to know you better, Miss Keene. And I thought if you could see that my intentions toward you and your son are straightforward and without hidden motive, you might be less inclined to cross the street when you see me coming." The tiniest thing happened at the corner of her mouth, a flicker gone almost instantly. "I do not cross the street," she said. "You crossed it 3 times last month. I had errands on that side. All 3 times coincidentally when I was on the other side." The flicker again. "A bit more of it." "You are very observant for a man who claims to have no particular interest in my comings and goings," she said. "I am the sheriff. Observation is the job." "Is observing my shopping schedule part of your official duties?" "The safety of all residents of Dust Creek falls within my official duties. Your routes home from the store fall within that." She looked at him, and the working to be neutral expression slipped a little, and what replaced it was something complex and genuinely fond, almost unwillingly fond, that made his heart do a stupid and entirely unprofessional thing in his chest. "Bernard Weston," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "You are a very irritating man." "I have been told that," he said. "You are also," she added more quietly, looking at the yard rather than at him, "apparently a very decent one." "I am not accustomed to that. It is taking some adjustment." He did not push it. He simply nodded and moved the conversation back to Croft, because Croft was the immediate problem and he was a practical man. Marshal Hayes was coming from Abilene with a deputy. They would arrive within 2 days. Bernard had arranged for them to set up a position to intercept Croft before he could reach Dust Creek, based on the most likely routes from the east. The plan was clean and had a reasonable probability of working. The main variable was Croft's intelligence, how much he knew about what they knew. "You should stay close to home for the next several days," Bernard said. "Not because you are in immediate danger, but because it is simpler if you are not in open view." "I have chores," Elsie said. "I know, but perhaps Martha Pryor could see to some of them." Elsie accepted this with the expression of a person who has been told something sensible that she finds mildly annoying. He recognized it as agreement. He left her with a promise to update her as soon as he had news, and he walked back to town thinking about the way she had said his name, first and last, as though testing the weight of it. And he decided he needed to think about Croft and the marshal's arrival and absolutely nothing else until the situation was resolved. He managed this for approximately half a day. Victor Croft arrived on the second day, ahead of schedule, which should have been impossible given the marshal's positioning, but was explained later by the discovery that Croft had taken an obscure southwestern trail that bypassed the main road, evidence of either very good luck or, more likely, very good information about who might be looking for him. Bernard was in his office when the young deputy he had taken on recently, a 20-year-old from Wichita named Drummond, came through the door at a near run. "Man just rode in," Drummond said, catching his breath. "Went straight to the saloon, asking about a woman named Hale. Not Keene, Hale." Bernard was on his feet and out the door before Drummond finished the sentence. The saloon was half full for late afternoon, the usual arrangement of men with drinks and cards and conversations that paused when the door opened. Bernard came in and found Croft immediately, because Croft was the kind of man who was easy to find once you knew the type, well-dressed in a city way, smooth-faced, with the practiced pleasantness of a man whose livelihood depended on looking trustworthy to the unwary. He was speaking to the barman. Bernard crossed the room at a measured pace, because running in the direction of a man you were planning to arrest was generally counterproductive. Croft turned when he felt the approach and the flash of the badge. His smooth face reorganized itself in an instant into something cooperative and open. "Sheriff," he said pleasantly. "Victor Croft," Bernard said. "There is an outstanding warrant for your arrest from the state of Missouri. You will come with me." Croft's pleasantness did not waver, which told Bernard this was a man who had been in this situation before and had a plan for it. "I believe there must be some mistake," he said. "My name is Charles Merchant. I am a traveling goods representative from—" "You are Victor Croft," Bernard said. "You will come with me now, or I will put you on the floor and then take you with me, and we can discuss your traveling goods representation at the office." Croft looked at him for a moment, assessing. Whatever he saw in Bernard's face apparently convinced him that the second option was not in his interest. He came. He was cooperative throughout the booking process, which Bernard found more concerning than resistance would have been, because it meant he was certain he had a way out. He did not have a way out. Marshal Hayes arrived 4 hours later, only slightly wrong-footed by Croft's earlier-than-expected appearance, and the handover was clean and legal and thorough. Hayes had not only the Missouri warrant but documentation from 2 other states that Bernard had not been aware of. Victor Croft was going to be in legal proceedings for the foreseeable future. He was not coming back to Dust Creek. Bernard sent Deputy Drummond to tell Elsie, because he needed to finish the paperwork with Hayes, and because he thought that if he went himself in the immediate aftermath of all of this, with the adrenaline still settling, and his own feelings about her more present in his mind than was professionally comfortable, he might say something else unplanned, and she had enough to process already. He heard from Martha Pryor later that Elsie had sat down at her kitchen table when Drummond told her, and had pressed both hands flat on the tabletop, and had been very quiet for a long time, and that Martha, who had been summoned to be present at Drummond's request, had put the kettle on and made tea and not said anything, which was, for Martha, an act of considerable self-discipline and genuine love. Bernard finished his paperwork. He ate a meal at the boarding house. He went to bed at a reasonable hour and lay awake for what he estimated was approximately 3 hours. He got up the next morning and went to her gate. He knocked on the post. He waited. She came to the door. She came down the steps. She opened the gate. She did not say anything for a moment. Neither did he. The morning was cold and still, and the sky was the pale, particular blue of late October on the prairie, high and wide and without sentimentality. "Come in," she said. He came in. She made coffee, not tea, coffee, strong and black, which told him something pleasing about her, and they sat at the kitchen table while Thomas crashed around the bedroom behind a closed door with his wooden spoon and what sounded like a tin pot. The domestic noise of it was something Bernard felt very distinctly in the center of his chest and chose not to examine too closely. "I owe you a genuine apology," Elsie said. She was looking at her coffee cup. "I was furious with you for going to Abilene. I had no right to that fury, considering that you were trying to help me. It was misdirected anger. The real anger belongs to Croft and to my circumstances, and perhaps in part to myself for being foolish enough to marry a man like Robert without seeing clearly what he was." "You were 22, Bernard said, and he was apparently skilled at presenting himself. "Yes, but I wanted to believe," she said, and then stopped. She pressed her lips together and then started again. "I wanted the story, the one in the novels. I was not careful enough about the difference between the story and the truth of the man. Most people make that mistake once," he said. "It is a human thing to want." She looked up at him. "Have you made it?" He considered lying because it was his own dark past and he did not generally discuss it, and then he thought about his promise to her and about what he had said about straightforward intentions. "Yes," he said. "Not in the same way, but yes." She waited, and he understood that she was giving him the choice of whether to continue, and that she would not press him either way. That restraint, that respect for his privacy after he had so conspicuously involved himself in hers, did something to him that he was not certain he had adequate vocabulary for. "I rode with a ranging company in Texas," he said slowly, "before I came north. The work we did there was sometimes necessary work, protecting settlers from raids, tracking rustlers, but sometimes it went beyond necessary. My commanding officer was a man who was willing to cross lines I thought should not be crossed, and I followed orders I should have refused, and people were hurt who should not have been hurt. Native people, families." He said it plainly, because he had learned that the worst thing about the darkest parts of a history was dressing them up in careful language, making them sound smaller and more manageable than they were. What had happened on those ranges in 1869 was not small. The Kiowa family whose home site the company had destroyed, the elder who had been killed by Sergeant Mullins while Bernard watched and was too slow, too uncertain, too tangled in the chain of command to prevent it. That was not something he had ever been able to make smaller by careful phrasing, and he had stopped trying. "I resigned my commission," he said. "I gave testimony against Mullins and my commanding officer to the federal inquiry, which made me exactly as popular as you might expect in those circles. I spent 3 years doing work that I hoped was restitution of some small kind. I have not decided whether I have managed it." Elsie was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not pity. He could not have borne pity, but something closer to recognition. As though she was seeing something in him that corresponded to something in herself. "We are carrying a great deal, the two of us," she said. "Yes. I do not think that is a reason for people to stay apart," she said, very carefully. "Though I have been behaving as though it is." He looked at her across the kitchen table. The morning light came through the window and made her hair the color of honey, and the coffee was very good, and Thomas was now apparently drumming on the floor with the wooden spoon and singing something to himself that had no discernible melody. "I know this is complicated for you," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything. I meant what I said at the gate." "I know you did," she said. "That was partly why it frightened me." She paused. "It has been a long time since anyone meant what they said to me. I understand that. "Do you," she started and then stopped and then tried again. "Do you know why I have been so determined to keep to myself? It is not only the business with Robert and Croft, it is Thomas." He waited. "If I let someone in," she said, "and it goes wrong, and I have reason to believe things can go wrong, I have empirical evidence of that, then it is not only me who is hurt. He is 2 years old. He is beginning to understand what fathers are. Other children have them. He has started asking Martha's husband questions with the very specific frequency of a child who is building a model of something he is missing." She said it level, but her hands on the table had tightened. "I cannot expose him to someone and then have that person leave. I cannot let him form an attachment and then have it broken. He has had enough broken things in his life already. He was 6 weeks old when his father died, but he will grow up in the shadow of that absence, and I will not compound it by being careless." Bernard listened to all of this. Then he said, "That is the most sound and reasonable explanation I have heard for the way you have been behaving, and I respect every word of it." She blinked. "I would like to offer one response," he said. She nodded. "I have not suggested carelessness," he said. "I have not rushed you. I have made one statement at your gate about my intentions, which were specifically that I would wait as long as you required. I am not asking you to expose Thomas to anything. I am asking slowly, at whatever pace you set to be worth trusting." She looked at him for a long time. "That is a very sensible response," she said. "I try to be sensible. You are frequently irritating. Also true. And occasionally you are." She paused, and the ghost of that smile moved at the corner of her mouth again, more substantial this time, more willing to be present. "You are occasionally quite wonderful, Bernard Weston, though I reserve the right to deny having said that." "Noted," he said. They drank their coffee. Thomas burst through the bedroom door with the wooden spoon held aloft like a scepter and said, "Bird," with enormous urgency, pointing at the window where a sparrow had briefly landed on the sill. Bernard looked at the sparrow. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Elsie. He realized, in very serious trouble. The kind of trouble that felt, for the first time in a long time, like something he did not particularly want to get out of. Over the following weeks, they built something careful and deliberate, the way you build anything in a place that has shown you how quickly structures can fail, with attention, with good materials, with an honest accounting of what will be asked of the thing you're building. Bernard began to stop by the house with a regularity that became understood rather than stated. Not every day, enough days that the pattern was clear and the consistency was real. He helped Elsie winterize the house in November, filling gaps in the walls with a mixture of clay and hay, checking the roof, cutting and stacking the firewood that the fall had not yet provided. He was useful in the practical way of a man who had spent his life solving problems with his hands as much as anything else. He was also unexpectedly good with Thomas. He had not, as far as Elsie could tell, any prior experience with small children, and this was visible in the slightly uncertain quality of his early interactions with her son. The way he handled the question of what to say to a 2-year-old with the same careful approach he seemed to bring to everything else, which was to observe first and respond honestly, rather than performing a version of hardiness that children of Thomas's age could detect and distrust with unerring accuracy. Thomas, for his part, had adopted Bernard with the discriminating but absolute loyalty of a very small person who has made a considered decision. By mid-November, Thomas's habit was to run to the gate when he heard Bernard coming and to be lifted over it and carried, which Bernard did with the matter-of-fact ease of a man for whom this had become natural, and which Elsie watched from the porch with a feeling she was slowly giving up pretending she did not have. She was in love with him. She had known it, she thought, since before she had words for it, perhaps since the morning at her kitchen table when he had told her about Texas with that quiet, undefended honesty, or perhaps since the sparrow and the wooden spoon and the way he had looked at her, and the world had felt briefly, perfectly manageable. She did not say it yet. They were building carefully, but she knew it, and she thought he knew it too, and the knowing was warmer and steadier than anything she had felt in years. December came in cold and dramatic. the way Kansas Decembers did, with a wind that had nothing between it and the flat horizon for 500 miles. Bernard's duties increased with the cold winter brought a particular brand of desperation to frontier towns, men stranded or out of work, the saloon doing its worst business of the year in terms of volume and its best in terms of consequences. He was tired more often. She could see it. She started leaving dinner for him when she knew his rounds would bring him past her house in the evening, a covered plate on the porch, nothing that required announcement or thanks. He left a note once, folded and tucked under the plate. "The best meal I have eaten this week, which is also the best meal I have eaten in some years. Thank you, E.K." She kept the note. It was in the tin box with the deed and Thomas's birth record and the $29. Christmas in Dust Creek was a communal affair, organized by the church and the Pryor family and anyone else with sufficient energy, which in a settlement of 200 people in deep winter was most of them. There was a gathering at the church hall, hymns and a reading, pine boughs and candles, a meal contributed by every family in town that turned the long tables into a landscape of covered dishes and bread and preserved fruit. Bernard came. He sat beside Elsie, which was noted by approximately everyone in the building and discussed extensively by Martha Pryor and her circle, though not, to their credit, unkindly. Thomas fell asleep with his head on Bernard's arm approximately 40 minutes into the proceedings, and Bernard did not move for the remaining hour of the meal out of an evident determination not to wake him, which left him eating his Christmas dinner with one hand, and with the studied nonchalance of a man pretending not to notice that this was happening. Elsie looked at him over Thomas's sleeping head and felt something give way inside her. The last of whatever carefully constructed inner structure had been keeping the full force of her feeling for this man at a manageable distance. She thought about what he had said at the gate, back in October, standing in the dying light with his hand on the rail and those steady gray eyes on her face. "I will still be here when you are ready to let someone in." She was ready. She had been ready, she thought, for some time. She had simply needed to be certain it was safe, not just for herself but for Thomas, and she was now certain with the quiet, unceremonious certainty that comes not from dramatic revelation but from accumulated evidence that it was. After the Christmas gathering, they walked home in the cold dark, she and Bernard and the sleeping Thomas, who had been carried out by Bernard, and had stayed asleep through the cold walk with the comfortable certainty of someone who trusted his transportation completely. At her gate, Bernard stopped and opened it and waited while she went through, and then he handed Thomas over with the practiced gentleness that still surprised her every time because it coexisted so naturally with the obvious physical strength of the man. She settled Thomas on her shoulder. She looked at Bernard. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked. It was a simple invitation, a frequent one between them over the past months. But something in her voice or in her face or in the accumulated weight of the evening made it into something else, and he heard it because his eyes changed, not dramatically, not in any way a stranger would have caught, but she was no longer a stranger. "Yes," he said, "I would." They sat in her kitchen with the lamp burning low and the coffee warm between their hands and Thomas asleep in his room, and they talked quietly about the small things and the large things in the easy way they had developed. And at some point, Elsie put her hand on the table between them, palm up, which was not a thing she planned, but which felt like the truest gesture she had made in years. He put his hand over it. His hand was large and calloused and very warm. "I am ready," she said, simply that. He looked at her across the table, and the lamp made his gray eyes darker, and the kitchen was warm, and the whole of the dark Kansas winter was outside and had absolutely no purchase on the inside of this room. "I know," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual, just slightly. "I have been here." "I know," she said. "I know you have." He did not kiss her that night. He was, she thought, possibly the most carefully considered man she had ever known. He squeezed her hand and he looked at her, and he said that he would call on her properly and ask to court her, if that was acceptable, and she thought she might actually laugh at the formality of it. This man who had ridden ranging companies in Texas and faced down card cheats in saloons and had an expressed preference for directness in all things, being scrupulously formal about a courtship. She did not laugh. She said yes, that would be more than acceptable. He came the following Sunday, properly, with his hat in his hand, and he asked her very formally if he might court her, which she accepted with the straight face that the occasion seemed to demand. And then she made coffee and they sat on the porch in the December cold under a shared blanket that Thomas immediately tried to monopolize. And they watched the prairie winter and said nothing much for a very pleasant hour. And it was one of the finest afternoons Elsie Keene had spent in recent memory. January brought snow that was serious about its intentions, blanketing Dust Creek in white and making travel difficult and home fires essential. The courtship proceeded in the particular indoor way of prairie winters, long evenings of conversation, books read aloud, Thomas's development observed and discussed with the shared attention of two people who had, without ceremony, accepted that they were both invested in it. Bernard told her more about Texas over the course of that winter, in careful pieces, the way you dismantle a wall brick by brick when you have decided to take it down. He told her about the specific night that had broken his conscience, the Kiowa family, the elder, the order he had been too slow to countermand. He told her about the federal inquiry and the testimony and the ostracism from his former colleagues that had followed. He told her about the 3 years he had spent afterward working with a Quaker relief organization in the territory, doing what small and insufficient things he could toward the repair of something that was not, in the full accounting, repairable. She listened to all of it. She did not minimize it, because he did not want that. She did not absolve him because he had not asked for absolution, and she thought he would not have trusted it. What she said when he was done was this: "You are a better man than you were." That is the most any of us can say about ourselves and the most that should be required. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had learned now to read, knew the subtle difference between his thoughtful quiet and his wounded quiet and the particular quality of his attention when he was moved and trying not to show it. This was the last one. "You are," he said after a moment, "the most honest person I have encountered in a long time." "I grew up as a printer's daughter," she said. "My father believed very strongly in the obligation of words." "He raised you well," Bernard said. "He did," she agreed, and felt the old simple grief of her parents' deaths, her father to influenza in 1872, her mother 2 years later, settle through her in its familiar way. "I wish he could have met you." The February of 1879 brought a thaw that was premature, and then a hard freeze that made the thaw feel like a mean joke. But it also brought Valentine's Day, which the church observed with a social. Bernard appeared at Elsie's gate that morning with a small bunch of dried prairie flowers, the only flowers available in Kansas in February, that he had clearly spent some time selecting, and that Elsie put in a tin cup on her kitchen table where they stayed until they crumbled, and she thought they were the most beautiful flowers she had ever been given. He kissed her for the first time that evening, on her porch after the Valentine social, very properly, with his hands only at her shoulders, and a gravity about it that somehow made it the most significant thing. The sense of his entire presence, his entire self, invested in the small and careful moment of it. She felt it from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet, and she stood for a moment afterward with her hands against his chest, and her forehead almost touching his chin, and thought, with a clarity that was simple and absolute, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Spring arrived in Dust Creek in April with its usual mix of mud and wild color, the prairie bursting into life with the impatient abundance of something that has been held down too long. Elsie's garden woke up. Thomas turned 3 in late March and had developed, over the winter, a personality of considerable complexity, opinionated, imaginative, occasionally exhausting, and entirely endearing. He called Bernard Burr, because Bernard was more letters than he felt the situation required. Bernard had begun to take Thomas on short excursions, to the livery to see the horses, to the post office to collect the mail, along the main street of Dust Creek with the small and very serious person holding two of his large fingers and narrating the world to him in Thomas's particular stream of consciousness style. Elsie watched them from a distance sometimes, these two people she loved most in the world moving through the world together, and felt something so warm and profound it was almost painful. She had started allowing herself to think about the future. Not the catastrophizing kind of future thinking she had been doing for 3 years, the what-ifs and how will I manages that had kept her company through the hard nights. The other kind, the good kind, where you imagine what something might look like when it is fully what it could be. In April, on an evening when the prairie light was golden and long and the garden smelled of turned earth and early growing things, Bernard said, "I would like to marry you, Elsie, if you are willing. And I would like to be Thomas's father properly, if he will have me. Though I recognize those are two separate questions, and you may have different answers to them." They were sitting on the porch steps which Thomas had recently vacated in favor of chasing a beetle around the yard. Elsie watched the beetle chase for a moment. "They are not separate questions," she said. "They are the same question for me. You cannot have one without the other." "I know," he said. "I am glad of that. The answer to both is what I am asking for." She looked at him, this gruff, careful, consequential man who had stood at her gate in October and made her a promise, and kept it through a long, cold winter, and all the difficult conversations and the slow, patient work of becoming someone she could trust. "Yes," she said. "The answer to both is yes." He let out a breath that she understood, in the way she now understood most of his expressions, had been held for some time. They were married in June, at the Dust Creek Church, in a ceremony that was small and real and attended by the whole town anyway, because it was Dust Creek, and the whole town considered itself invited to everything. Martha Pryor wept with a thoroughness that suggested she had been storing up tears for this purpose for some time. Deputy Drummond, who had been recruited as Bernard's attendant in the absence of a closer male friend, stood very straight and very nervous throughout. Thomas wore a small suit that Martha had sewn and spent the ceremony sitting in the front pew next to the Pryor children, with the expression of someone who understands that an important event is occurring and is committed to participating in it correctly. When Bernard put the ring on Elsie's finger, his hands were perfectly steady, which she had expected. Her hands were shaking, which she had not. He held them between his, and something about the weight and warmth of that steadied her entirely. They said their vows in the clear June light with the whole of Dust Creek bearing witness. And when it was done, when the minister had said the words and Bernard had kissed her, and the church had erupted in the particular Dust Creek brand of celebration, which involved Martha Pryor beginning to sing before anyone else was ready, Elsie felt the last locked room in her chest open, quietly and without drama, and light come through. The first year of their marriage was the particular kind of full that Elsie had stopped believing she would have. Bernard moved into her house, or rather into their house, since the deed transferred to both their names, and the dynamic reorganization required by this was occasionally comic and frequently requiring of the genuine negotiation that neither of them had any trouble with. Bernard had opinions about where things should be stored. Elsie had opinions about every single other thing. They discussed these opinions with the mutual stubbornness of two people who knew how to hold a position, and the mutual respect of two people who knew when a position was worth holding. Thomas took to the new arrangement with a 3-year-old sublime adaptability, reclassified his sleeping arrangements to accommodate the changed household mathematics, and within 2 weeks was treating Bernard's presence as both permanent and personally attributable to himself, as though he had arranged it. He told the Miller boy that his father is the sheriff. Elsie reported to Bernard one evening in July, with the particular tone of a person reporting intelligence that requires careful handling. Bernard was sitting at the kitchen table cleaning his revolver, which he did with the regular, methodical attention he gave to all the tools of his work. He looked up at this. "Is that a problem?" he asked. She thought about it. "No," she said, "it is the truth. He has had you as his father since February. The name just caught up." Bernard was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. Then he said roughly, "He is a fine boy, Elsie." "He is," she agreed. "He gets it from his mother." She saw the smile, which was still one of the things she liked best in the world, the way it transformed his weathered face, how it was always earned because it was never assumed. In the autumn of 1879, Elsie discovered she was pregnant. She told Bernard on a Sunday morning while Thomas was at the Priors, and she watched his face go through a rapid sequence of things before settling into an expression that was entirely unguarded and entirely beautiful. "Are you well?" he said, which was not the first thing she had expected but was entirely Bernard. "I am well," she said. "Very well, actually. Are you?" She stopped. He came around the kitchen table and took her face in both his rough hands and kissed her, and then pressed his forehead against hers and stayed there for a moment. And she could feel that he was moved in a way that went beyond language, which was where the deepest things always lived for him. "I am everything," he said. "Everything good." The pregnancy proceeded well through the winter. Bernard was both practically helpful and extraordinarily solicitous in a way that he was clearly trying to modulate and frequently failing to, resulting in Elsie having to firmly insist on several occasions that she was quite capable of carrying the water bucket herself and was not made of glass. He accepted these corrections with the good grace of a man who knew when he was being somewhat irrational, but found himself unable to entirely stop. In May of 1880, their son James Bernard Weston was born, delivered by Dr. Aldrich in their bedroom on a spring morning while Bernard sat in the kitchen with Thomas, and conducted what Thomas later reported to Martha as a very long and quiet waiting. Elsie heard him through the door at one point saying the Lord's Prayer in a low voice, and she made a mental note to tell him, when this was over, that she found that entirely acceptable evidence of his humanity. James was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's particular stubbornness of expression. Thomas inspected him with the critical thoroughness of an older sibling establishing the terms of the relationship, concluded that he was acceptable, and thereafter appointed himself James's primary educator, a role he filled with enormous commitment and very little accuracy. Bernard held his son for the first time with the careful reverence of a man holding something irreplaceable, and Elsie watched from the bed, exhausted and luminously happy, and thought about the man who had stood at her gate in October of 1878 with his hand on the rail and his promise in the air between them. The thing about love, she thought, the real kind, the kind built from honesty and patience and choosing each other through the difficult and the ordinary, was that it did not look like the novels had promised. It was quieter and stranger and harder and better, and it required you to be braver than you thought you could be. It required you to open the gate. She was glad she had opened the gate. Dusk Creek grew over the following years. The railroad, which had been a rumor and then a promise and then a distant fact, arrived in the area in 1882, not through Dusk Creek itself, but close enough that the town felt the gravitational pull of the increased traffic and commerce. A new schoolhouse was built that operated 5 days a week. A second doctor arrived. The Priors expanded their store. The church got a new roof that did not leak. Bernard's work changed with the growth. More people meant more complexity, more disputes, more of the particular friction that comes when a place is in the process of becoming something different from what it was. He handled it with the same steady directness he brought to everything, and he was reappointed sheriff by the county seat in both 1881 and 1883, with a unanimity that suggested Dusk Creek had made its opinion known. He and Elsie talked in the evenings about what the town was becoming and what they wanted for their children in it. Thomas, by 1883, was 8 years old and attending school with a focused intensity that suggested he had his mother's disposition toward the written word. James was 3, which was an age that Bernard had privately noted was the most persistently eventful of the childhood years, based on his experience with Thomas and now with James, who had an approach to the physical world that could be best described as entrepreneurial in its risk tolerance. "Is going to give me gray hair," Bernard told Elsie one evening in September of 1883, when James had been retrieved from the roof of the chicken house for the third time that month. "You already have gray hair," Elsie said. "You arrived with it. More gray hair then." "He is 3," she said. "Thomas was the same. Thomas was never on the chicken house roof. Thomas was in the well," she reminded him. Bernard had the expression of a man revisiting an unpleasant memory. "That was different." "It was considerably more alarming," she agreed. They were sitting on the porch in the September dusk, which was still the best hour of the day, the heat gone, the sky going pink and amber, the sounds of the town settling into its evening rhythms. James was in bed, successfully at ground level. Thomas was inside at the kitchen table working through the arithmetic problems his teacher had assigned with a patience that Elsie found both admirable and slightly amusing, given that she remembered very clearly being 8 and having no patience for arithmetic whatsoever. Bernard's arm was around her shoulders, and she was leaning against him in the comfortable way of people who have been doing this for long enough that it has become as natural as breathing. The silver star on his vest caught the last light. "I have been thinking," she said. He said. This was his invitation for her to continue. "Helen has written that she is considering coming west. She is not married, and the situation in Cincinnati is," she paused. "She is not happy. She is 32 years old, and she has been keeping our father's printing business since he died, and it has been sold now, and she has no particular reason to stay. You would like her to come here," he said. "I would like her to be invited, certainly. Whether she comes is her own decision, but yes, I would like her here if she would have it." "Then write to her," he said. "There is good land still available on the north edge of town. Aldrich has been trying to find a tenant for the McBride house since McBride went to Wichita." Elsie turned her head to look at him. "You have thought about this already?" "It occurred to me," he said, with the studied neutrality of a man whose wife has sometimes accused him of being conspiratorial in his helpfulness. She smiled at him. "You are a managing sort of person, Bernard Weston." "I am a practical sort of person," he corrected. "You are both," she said. "I find I do not mind." Helen Keene arrived in Dust Creek in March of 1884, on the tail end of a hard winter, looking somewhat wind-battered and entirely game. She was a tall woman, angular where Elsie was rounded, with the same intelligent eyes and the same printer's daughter directness of speech. She and Bernard assessed each other over the dinner table on her first evening, with the mutual caution of two people who were going to be in each other's lives for the foreseeable future, and were taking the measure of what that would require. By the end of the week, they had arrived at a mutual respect that Elsie found deeply gratifying. By the end of the month, Helen had taken the McBride house, set up a small bookkeeping and letter-writing service for the less literate residents of Dust Creek, and had begun attending the church social with the focused attention of a woman who is making a careful survey of her options. "I am not looking to be managed into anything," Helen told Elsie firmly, when Elsie made a comment about Helen spending a great deal of time talking with the new land office clerk, a pleasant widower named Collins. "I have not managed anything," Elsie said. "You have that look." "What look?" "The very happy look," Helen said, with the combination of affection and exasperation that is specific to sisters. "You want everyone to have what you have." Elsie thought about this. "Is that unreasonable?" "No," Helen admitted. "It is obnoxiously reasonable, which is the most irritating kind of reasonable." What Elsie had by the spring of 1884 was this: a house that was her home in every sense of the word, repaired and expanded over the years until it sat comfortable and solid under the Kansas sky. A garden that she had turned from grudging dry soil into something that produced generously through the growing season. 2 sons, Thomas, 9 years old and already showing the particular marks of a person who would make something of himself through sheer determined intelligence, and James, 4 years old and a force of nature, currently engaged in a project involving mud and sticks that had a conceptual grandeur somewhat outpacing his engineering capacity. A sister within walking distance for the first time in 7 years. A town that knew her and in which she was known, not as the widow Hale, not as the woman with the difficult past, but as Elsie Weston, Bernard's wife, Thomas and James's mother, the woman with the remarkable garden and the kitchen table where good coffee was always available. And Bernard Weston, who had stood at her gate 6 years ago with his hand on the rail and his promise in the air, and who had kept that promise with the same steady, unceremonious faithfulness he brought to everything, who had sat at her kitchen table through the long winter and told her his darkness as she told him hers, and who had taken her hand and her son and made them his with a completeness that she had once believed was impossible. He was not a romantic man in the showy sense. He did not declaim or perform. His love was expressed in the way he fixed her fence when the cattle got through before she noticed it needed fixing, in the way he listened with complete attention when she talked, in the way he was simply, reliably present day after day, through the ordinary and the difficult and the beautiful moments of a life they were building together. He told her he loved her. He said it in the straightforward way he said everything that mattered directly, without preamble, in moments both significant and ordinary, as though it was simply a true thing that bore repeating. She told him the same. It had not gotten smaller. It had, like the garden, simply continued to grow. In the summer of 1884, Elsie discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time, which she told Bernard while he was repairing the fence at the south end of their property, crouched in the summer grass with tools in his hands and sweat on his face, and the expression of a man deeply involved in a practical problem. He stopped what he was doing. He looked at her. The gray eyes that she could read the way she could read a well-known text did the rapid sequence again, the one she had first seen in the kitchen when she told him about James, and then settled into that unguarded warmth that was one of his best expressions. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He stood up and kissed her, right there in the summer grass by the fence, with the tools still in his hand and the sun overhead, and she laughed against his mouth, and the sound of it carried out across the wide Kansas sky. Their daughter was born in February of 1885. They named her Clara Helen Clara for Bernard's mother, who had died when he was 12 and who he had loved with the particular intensity of a boy who lost his mother young, and Helen for Elsie's sister, who cried when told and then denied it with some force. Clara had her mother's coloring and her father's solemnity, which was a combination Elsie found so exactly perfect that she sometimes simply looked at her daughter and felt the kind of gratitude that has no adequate articulation. Thomas, at 10, appointed himself Clara's protector with a gravity that touched everyone who witnessed it. James, at 5, was enthusiastic and occasionally alarming in his attentions, but Clara seemed to find him acceptable. She was a calm baby, which Bernard said was purely her mother's doing, and Elsie said was purely his, and they were both possibly wrong and possibly both right. One evening in March of that year, when Clara was a month old and sleeping in the cradle Bernard had built over the winter, a beautiful thing, solid and smooth, made with the same careful attention he brought to everything, Elsie sat in the rocking chair by the window and watched the Kansas stars, and felt the fullness of it all so acutely that she pressed her free hand to her chest as though to hold it in. Bernard came into the room and saw her sitting there, and he came and crouched beside the rocking chair in that way he had, so that his face was level with hers, and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had known for 6 years and still found inexhaustible. "All right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. "I was just thinking." "What about the gate?" she said. He understood immediately. She could see it in his face. "October 1878, you standing there in the sunset looking completely immovable." "I was significantly alarmed," he said. "For the record," she smiled. "You were not remotely visible as alarmed. That was deliberate. You said you would still be there when I was ready. I said it, he agreed. I meant it. I know. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw, feeling the roughness of it, the familiar particular solidity of him. I am so glad I opened the gate. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, which he had done on 100 occasions, and which still did the same thing to her it always had. So am I, he said. Outside, the Kansas prairie lay under its winter dark, cold and immeasurable and full of stars. And inside the house Elsie Weston had built from nothing and stubbornness and hope. The lamp burned warm and Clara breathed small and even in her cradle. And Bernard Weston stayed exactly where he had promised, not at the gate any longer, but fully inside, in every sense that mattered, in the home she had made, and the life she had opened to him, and the love she had chosen with both eyes clear. This was not the story from the novels of her youth. It was something better. It was true, and it was hers, and it was good. The spring of 1885 brought the prairie to life with its usual extravagance. Elsie planted her garden in April under a sky of extravagant blue, with Clara in a cloth carrier against her chest and James making a determined mess of the seed rows behind her, and Thomas reading on the porch with one eye on James in the resigned manner of an older sibling who has accepted a supervisory role he did not apply for. Bernard came home at noon with a loaf from the baker, and they sat on the porch steps in the spring warmth and ate and watched the garden. And Thomas read aloud to them from the book he was working through, a history of the Louisiana Purchase that he had obtained from the school, reading in his clear, careful voice while James ate his bread with competitive speed and Clara slept against Elsie's chest. "He reads well," Bernard said quietly. "He has since he was 5, Elsie said. He had to be told not to read during meals until he was 7, and I am not certain the lesson fully took." "It did not," Thomas said, without looking up from the book. "Then put it down," Elsie said, without heat. Thomas put it down. He looked at his father with the particular expression he wore when he had something he was considering saying. Thomas, at 10, was beginning to have the complexity of a person who could hold an idea for a while before releasing it. "Father," he said, "Thomas, my friend Caleb says that the county sheriff is going to be an elected position now, starting next term. Is that true?" Bernard glanced at Elsie. "It is. Will you stand for election? I have been thinking about it." "You should," Thomas said with simple certainty. "You are good at it. Everyone says so." He paused. "Caleb's father says you are the best sheriff the county has had in 20 years, and his father does not say complimentary things about most people." "I know Caleb's father," Bernard said. "The compliment means a good deal." "You should stand," Thomas said again, and returned to his book, apparently having delivered the opinion he had been holding and considered the matter settled. Bernard looked at Elsie with the expression that meant he found their son both surprising and completely recognizable. "He is yours," Elsie said. "He is mine," Bernard agreed, with a warmth in his voice on those 3 words that was not simple acknowledgment but something full and grateful and real. Bernard did stand for election that autumn. The campaign, such as it was in Dust Creek, was a modest affair, a public meeting at the church hall, a notice in the Dodge City paper that covered their area, some discussion at the general store. He won by a margin that was not surprising to Elsie, and that left him slightly uncomfortable with the attention, which was also not surprising. He accepted the result with the same absence of drama he brought to most things, and Dust Creek continued as it had, under the steady hand of a man who had learned, through a long and sometimes very difficult life, that the best thing you could do in any place was show up honestly, treat people fairly, and stay when things were hard. He had done all 3. He continued to do all 3. Helen Keene, in the autumn of 1885, married the land office clerk Collins, who had been patient and steady in his courtship for the better part of 18 months, and who treated Helen with the mixture of humor and genuine respect that she required. Elsie stood beside her sister at the ceremony with Clara on her hip and Bernard at her side and felt the particular joy of watching someone you love choose well. "Did you manage that?" Helen murmured to her afterward. "Not even slightly," Elsie said. "Collins is simply a decent man who recognized a remarkable woman." Said Helen, which was her version of being moved. Dust Creek by the late 1880s was unrecognizable from the spare settlement Elsie had arrived in with a trunk and a newborn and $37. It had grown into a proper town, with a proper school and a proper medical practice and a millinery and a newspaper that published weekly. The people who had arrived early, who had built the place from the ground up through hard winters and dry summers and all the friction and beauty of frontier life, had put down roots that had become the town's foundation. Elsie Weston was one of those people. She had come with nothing and she had built something, and the building had been the work of her own two hands and her stubborn, indefatigable will, and she was proud of it in the quiet way. She was proud of most things, not loudly, but genuinely and without apology. She was 34 years old in 1885, and she was more fully herself than she had ever been in her life. The girl in Cincinnati who had wanted the story from the novels had grown into a woman who had a better story, earned rather than fantasized, grounded in the real and imperfect and magnificent substance of actual life. She had a man who loved her without pretension or performance. She had children who were becoming people she deeply admired. She had a sister in the next street and a friend in Martha Pryor who had been constant through every season. She had a garden that gave back more than she put in, and a house that was solid and warm, and a view of the prairie from her porch that changed every day with the weather and the light, and was never the same twice. And she had, at the center of all of it, Bernard. On a June evening in 1886, they sat on the porch together in the late light, as they had done hundreds of times. Thomas, now 11, and helping James build something ambitious and probably structurally unsound in the yard. Clara, a year old, and pulling herself carefully along the porch railing with the concentrated determination of a person, learning what her body is capable of, and Bernard reached over and took Elsie's hand in his. And they sat in the particular silence that is not empty but full, that belongs to people who have said the difficult things, and can now be quiet together in the knowledge of what they are to each other. "I was thinking," Bernard said after a while. "Yes," she said, "when I stood at your gate that first time I came, October of '78. 8 years ago," she said. "Almost 8." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that I did not know then that this was what I was waiting for. I knew I wanted to be honest with you, and I knew I was not going to walk away. But I did not know, I could not have imagined," he stopped, in the way he did when words were proving insufficient. She understood. She felt the same inadequacy of language when she tried to think about the distance between that October evening and this June one, the magnitude of what had been built in the intervening years. "You did not need to imagine it," she said. "You simply needed to stay." "Yes," he said, "that I could do." Clara let go of the railing and took 3 unsteady steps across the porch to Bernard's chair before sitting down abruptly on the porch boards with the expression of a person slightly surprised by her own achievement. Bernard looked at her, and the smile came, the full one, the one that transformed his face entirely. He lifted her onto his lap and she grabbed his badge with both hands, and Thomas looked over from the yard and said, "She walked, James, she walked." And James said, "I saw." Though he clearly hadn't, and Martha Pryor chose that precise moment to come up the road and see the commotion, and began to exclaim at a volume that put the evening birds to flight. It was ordinary and it was everything. The gate was still there. Elsie had replaced the boards twice over the years, but kept the same iron hinges, the same general dimensions, a kind of deliberate continuity. On summer mornings, walking out to the garden, she passed through it with the unconscious ease of a woman at home in her own life, and she never passed through it without, in some small and private corner of her mind, feeling the ghost of what it had once meant to stand on the other side of it with everything locked and bolted. She was glad beyond the power of adequate expression that she had opened it. She was glad that Bernard Weston had stood at it on an October evening in 1878 with his hand on the rail and his gray eyes steady and his patience absolute, and had said what he said, and had meant it, and had been there still every morning since. The gate was open now. It had been open for a long time, and everything worth having had come through it. Some years later, when Clara was old enough to ask about the gate and why her mother sometimes stopped to touch the post when she passed it, Elsie told her the story. The whole of it, Abilene and Victor Croft, Cincinnati and Robert Hale, the advertisement in the newspaper and the wagon ride to Dusk Creek and the baby in her arms and the $37, and the way she had spent 3 years building walls and a man had stood at her gate in the dying light and refused to let her stay alone in the walled place forever. Clara listened with the serious attention of her father and the imaginative intensity of her mother, and when Elsie was done, Clara said, "He was already in love with you then, when he stood at the gate." "I think so," Elsie said, "and you were in love with him." "I did not want to be," Elsie said. "That is different from not being." Clara thought about this with the particular depth of a child who processes things slowly and completely. "But you let him in eventually," she said. "I did," Elsie said. "Why then? Why that night?" Elsie thought about it. "Because I was tired of being afraid," she said, "and because he was worth not being afraid for." Clara nodded as though this made complete sense, as though the arithmetic of it was simple. And perhaps it was, Elsie thought. Perhaps from a certain angle with the right distance, the arithmetic of love was always simple. You found someone whose presence made the world more possible, and you chose them, and you kept choosing them, and that was the whole of it. She had chosen. She had been chosen, and the choosing had made everything. Bernard came home that evening from his rounds at the time he always came home, at the time she had come to know as simply the time the day became complete, and he came through the gate and up the porch steps, and she was there as she always was, and he took off his hat in that way he had and looked at her with those gray eyes that were older now and deeper and still, after all these years, inexhaustible. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. He kissed her. He sat down beside her on the porch. He took her hand. The prairie evening was long and golden, and somewhere inside the house, Clara was practicing the piano that Bernard had somehow arranged to have brought from Dodge City for her birthday, filling the warm air with slightly uncertain music that was, despite its uncertainty, entirely lovely. Thomas was away at school in Dodge City now, 17 years old and ferociously determined to become a lawyer, which neither of his parents found surprising in the least. James, 12, was in the yard engaged in something that had the hallmarks of one of his more elaborate projects, currently involving 3 wooden crates, a length of rope, and a philosophical certainty that the laws of physics were more suggestions than requirements. Bernard Weston sat on the porch of the home he had made with the woman he loved and watched his son, and listened to his daughter, and held his wife's hand in the wide golden evening of the Kansas prairie, and felt the full particular weight of a life that had turned out to be everything good, as he had once said, in a Cincinnati-like kitchen with coffee between them and a sleeping boy in the next room. Everything good. It had turned out, against the odds of 2 damaged and careful people and a weathered gate and a long, hard winter, to be exactly that. And the gate stood open, as it had stood for years, letting in everything that deserved to come through.